Read by Ben Tucker. The Jade Bracelet by Mary E. Wilkins Freeman. Lawrence Evarts was on his way home from his law office in Somerset when he caught sight of the inexplicable circle in the snow. The snow was hard and smooth, and the circle immediately arrested his attention. It was just outside the compact snow of the sidewalk, in what would have been the gutter had there been any gutters in Somerset. Lawrence carried a neatly folded umbrella. He was exceedingly punctilious in all his personal habits. It had threatened snow earlier in the day, although now the sky was brilliantly clear, and the stars were shining out, one by one, in the ineffable rose, violet, and yellow tints of the horizon. Lawrence poked with the steel point of his umbrella at the circle and struck something hard. He endeavored to lift whatever it was with the umbrella point, but was unable to do so. Then, frowning a little, he removed his English glove, plunged his hand into the snow, and drew it up again with the jade bracelet. It was beautiful, cabbage-green jade, cut out of solid stone and very large. A man's bracelet, and rather large for his own hand. Evarts had a small hand. He stood staring at it. He immediately remembered having seen somewhere, in a Chinese laundry, a Chinaman wearing a bracelet of a similar design. But there was no Chinese laundry in Somerset. He could not remember that there was one in Lloyd's, which was the only other village for miles large enough to support a laundry. Once a Chinaman had penetrated to Somerset, but the hoodlum element, which was large and flourishing, had routed him out. He had disappeared presumably for more peaceful fields of cleanliness, although there had been dark rumors which had died away, both for lack of substantiation and of interest in the uncanny heathen, as most of these citizens adjudged him. Lawrence stood gazing at the thing with wonder. Then, obeying some unaccountable impulse, he slipped it over his right hand, the one from which he had removed the glove. Immediately the horror was upon him. He realized, although fighting hard against the realization, that there was another hand beside his own in the jade bracelet. He gave his hand a sharp jerk to rid himself of the sensation, but it remained. He could feel the other hand and wrist, although he could see absolutely nothing. Only his sense of touch was reached, and one other, his sense of smell. Overpowering the clear, frosty atmosphere came the strange pungency of opium and sandalwood. But worse than the uncanny assailing of the senses, far worse, was something else. Into his clear Western mind, trained from infancy to logical inferences, Christian belief, and right estimates of things, stole something foreign and antagonistic. Strange memories, strange outlooks, seemed misting over his own familiar ones as smoke mists a window. Evarts snatched the bracelet from his wrist and gave it a fling back into the snow. Then something worse happened. He still had the feeling of the thing on his wrist, but the pull of the other hand and wrist became stronger. He fairly choked with the opium smoke, and the strange cloud dimmed his own personality with greater force. He drew on his glove, but unmistakably it would not go on over the invisible bracelet. "What the devil?" Evarts said quite aloud. He could see in the snow the clearly cut circle where the bracelet had fallen. He withdrew his glove, picked up the thing again, put it on, and walked along, shaking the snow from his hand. It was unmistakably better on than off. The strange sensations were not so pronounced. Still, it was bad enough, in all conscience. Presently, as he walked along, Evarts met a friend who stared at him after he had said good evening. "What is the matter? Are you ill?" he asked, turning back. "No," replied Evarts shortly. "You look like the deuce," his friend remarked wonderingly. Evarts was conscious that the man stood still a moment staring at him, but he did not turn. He walked on, feeling as if he were in handcuffs with the devil. It became more and more horrible. When he reached his boarding house, he went straight to his room and did not go down to dinner. No one came to ask why he did not. He had not any intimates in the house, and indeed was one who was apt to keep himself to himself, regulate his own actions, and resent questions concerning them. He turned on his electric light and tried to write a letter. He was able to do that, as far as mere mechanical action was concerned. The other hand moved in accordance with his, but what he wrote... Evarts stared incredulously at the end of the first page. What he had written was in a language unfamiliar to him, both in words and characters, and yet the meaning was horribly clear. He could not conceive of the possibility of his writing things of such hideous significance. and moreover, of a significance hitherto unknown to him. He tore up the sheet and threw it into the waste paper basket. Then he lit his pipe and tried to smoke, but the scent of opium came in his nostrils instead of tobacco. He flung his pipe aside and took up the evening paper, but to his horror, he read in a twofold fashion, as one may see double. There were horrors enough as usual, but there were horrors besides which dimmed them. He tossed the paper to the floor and sat for a few moments looking about him. He had rather luxurious apartments, a large sitting room, bedroom, and bath, and he had gathered together some choice things in the way of furniture and bric-a-brac. He had rather a leaning to Oriental treasures, and there were some good things in the way of Persian rugs and hangings. Just before his chair was a fine prayer rug, with its graceful triangle which should point toward the holy city. Suddenly he seemed to see, kneeling there, not a Moslem, but a small figure in a richly wrought robe, with a long slimy braid, and before it sat a squat grinning bronze god. That was too much. "Good God," Everts muttered to himself, and sprang up. He got his coat and hat and put them on hurriedly and rushed out of the room and the house, all the time with that never-ceasing sensation of the other hand and wrist in the jade bracelet. He hurried down the street until he reached the office of a physician, a friend of his, perhaps the closest he had in Somerset. There was a light in the office, and Everts entered without ceremony. Dr. Van Brunt was alone. He had just finished his dinner and was having his usual smoke, leaning back luxuriously in a very old Morris chair, well worn to all the needs of his figure. He was a short man, heavily blonde-bearded. "Thank God I smell tobacco instead of that cursed other thing," was Everts' first salutation. Van Brunt looked at him, then he jumped up with heavy alacrity. "For heaven's sake, what's to pay, old man?" he said. "The devil, I rather guess," answered Everts, settling himself in a forlorn hunch on the nearest chair. Dr. Van Brunt remained standing, looking at him with consternation. "You look like the devil," he remarked finally. "I feel like him, I reckon," responded Everts gloomily. Now that he was there, he shrank from confidence. He felt a decided tug on his wrist and hardly seemed to realize himself at all, because of the cloud of another personality before his mental vision. Dr. Van Brunt stood before him, scowling with perplexity, his fuming pipe in hand. Then he said suddenly, "What in thunder is that thing you've got on your wrist?" "Some token from hell, I begin to think," answered Everts. "Where did you get it?" "I found it in the snow near the corner of State Street, and I was fool enough to put the infernal thing on." "Why on earth don't you take it off if it bothers you?" "I have tried it, and the second state is worse than the first. Look here, what is it? You know I never drink except an occasional glass of wine at dinner, and an occasional pint of beer, mostly to keep you company. Of course I do. What? You know I am not in any sense a drinking man. Of course I know it. Why? Why? Everts faced him fiercely. Why then do I see things that nobody except men who have sold their souls and wits for drink see? You don't. Yes, I do. I must be mad. For God's sake, Van Brunt, tell me if I am mad, and do something for me if you can. Van Brunt sat down again in his chair and took a whiff of his pipe, but he did not remove his great blue eyes from Everts. "Mad nothing," he said. "Don't you suppose I know a maniac when I see him? What on earth are you ranting about anyway? And what is it about that green thing on your arm, and why don't you take it off?" "I tell you I am in the innermost circles of hell when it is off," cried Everts. "What made you put the thing on, anyway?" "I don't know. My evil angel, I reckon." Dr. Van Brunt leaned forward and looked closely at the jade bracelet. "It is a fine specimen," he said. "I've never seen anything like it, except—" He hesitated a moment and was evidently endeavoring to recall something. "I know where I saw one like it," he said suddenly. "That poor devil of a Chinaman who started a laundry here 5 years ago and was routed out of town had its facsimile. I remember noticing it one day just before he was run out. Don't you remember?" "I don't know what I remember," replied Everts. He jerked the bracelet angrily as he spoke, then gave a great start of terror, for the invisible thing which he felt had seemed to come closer at the jerk. "Why on earth don't you take that thing off?" asked Van Brunt again. He continued to smoke and to watch his friend closely. "Didn't I tell you it was worse off than on?" "Then he gets so close. Ugh." "He? Who?" "Don't ask me. How do I know? The devil, I think, or one of his friends. Rot! It's so. Sit down, Everts, and have a pipe, and put that nonsense out of your head. Put it out of my head, repeated Everts bitterly. Suddenly a thought struck him. See here, you don't believe that I'm talking rationally, he said. I think something has happened to upset you, replied Van Brunt guardedly. I see. Well, try the thing yourself. Everts, as he spoke, withdrew the bracelet with a jerk. He paled perceptibly as he did so, and set his mouth hard as if with pain or disgust. He extended the shining green circle toward Van Brunt, who took it, laughing, although there was an anxious gleam in his eyes. Van Brunt, oddly enough, since he was a large man, had small hands. The bracelet slipped on his wrist as easily as it had done on Everts. He sat quite still for a second. He gave one more puff at his pipe, then he laid it on the table. His great blond face changed. He looked at Everts. What is this infernal thing, anyhow? He said. Don't ask me, I am as wise as yourself. But now you know what torment I am in. Everts spoke with feeble triumph. You don't mean you feel it without the bracelet? Try it. Van Brunt took off the bracelet and laid it on the table beside his pipe. His face contracted. My God, he ejaculated. Now you know. Good Lord, I am remembering devilish things which never happened. I'm going backward like a crab. Everts nodded. You mean you feel the same thing? Don't I? As if some infernal thing was handcuffed to you? Everts nodded. Well, said Van Brunt slowly, I did not think I believed in much of anything, but now I believe in the devil. He took up the bracelet. Everts made a sudden gesture of remonstrance. For the love of God, let me have it on again, he said hoarsely. I don't think I can stand this much longer. Van Brunt gave the bracelet to Everts, who slipped it over his hand. Immediately an expression of something like relief came over his face. You don't feel quite so with it on? Asked Van Brunt. No, but it is bad enough anyway. And you? Van Brunt grimaced. As for me, I am handcuffed to a fiend, he said. Everett sat down with the bracelet still on his wrist. Van Brunt, what does it mean? He asked helplessly. Ask me what it is on the other side of the moon. You honestly don't know? I can't diagnose the case or cases unless you are crazy and the microbe has hit me too, for I am as crazy as you are. Everett looked down at the shining green circle on his wrist. I wish I'd let the thing alone, said he. So do I. Suddenly Van Brunt rose. He was a man of a less sensitive nervous organization than the other, and his mouth was set hard and even his hands clenched as for a fight. See here, old fellow, he said. We've had enough of this. It is time to put a stop to it. Have you had any dinner? Do you think... began Everts. Well, you've got to eat dinner whether you want to or not. This is nonsense. Van Brunt struck the call bell on his table violently, and his man entered. A look of surprise overspread his face as he looked at his master and Everts, but said nothing. Tell Hannah if there was any soup left over from dinner to warm it immediately and send up whatever else was left. Mr. Everts has not dined. Tell her to be as quick as possible. Yes, sir, replied the man. And Thomas? Yes, sir. Get a bottle of that old port and open it. Yes, sir. After the man had gone, Everts and Van Brunt sat in a moody silence. Both were pale and both had expressions of suffering and disgust, as if from the contact of some loathsome thing, but Van Brunt still kept his mouth set hard. He even resumed his pipe. It was not long before dinner was announced, and he sprang to his feet and laid his hand on Everts' shoulder. Now come, old man, he said. When you've got some good roast beef and old port in your stomach, the mists will leave your brain. The mists are on your brain, and you have the good roast beef in your stomach, returned Everts bitterly, but he arose. But I haven't the old port, said Van Brunt with an attempt at jocularity as the two men entered the dining room. Van Brunt kept bachelor's hall, and the neat maid was in attendance. Her master saw her quick glance of amazement at their altered faces. You may go, Katie, said Van Brunt. Mr. Everts and I will wait upon ourselves. After the maid had left, Everts leaned his elbows on the table and bent his head forward with a despairing gesture. I can't eat, he almost moaned. You can and will, replied Van Brunt, and ladled out the smoking soup. Everts did eat mechanically, and both men drank of the old port. They sat side by side at the table for the greater convenience of serving. After Everts had finished his dinner and the two men had dispatched the wine, they looked at each other. Everts gave a glance of horror at the green thing on his wrist. "Well?" he said with a kind of interrogative bitterness. Van Brunt tried to laugh. "Take that confounded thing off and put it out of your mind," he said. "You want to wear it yourself," Everts returned almost savagely. Van Brunt laughed. "No, I don't. I can stand it," he said. "But I'll be hanged if I believe I could suffer much more in hell. The devilish thing is converting me, paradoxically." "What does it mean?" asked Everts again. "Don't know. If it keeps up much longer, I'll try a narcotic for both of us." "Not," Everts shuddered. "No, not opium, if I know myself." As he spoke, Van Brunt had his eyes fixed upon a spot directly in front of the fireplace, and Everts knew that he saw what he himself saw, the horrible, prostrate figure covered with embroideries, and the grinning idol. "You see?" he gasped. "Yes, I do see, confound it. I'll do something before long. You feel as if—" "Yes." "There is something between us." "Yes. Don't talk about it. I'll do something soon if it keeps up." Everts made a quick gesture. He grasped the table knife beside him. "I'll do something now," he cried, and made a thrust. Van Brunt's face whitened. Almost simultaneously he grasped another knife and did the same thing. Then the two men drew long breaths and looked at each other. "It's gone," said Everts, and he almost sobbed. Van Brunt was still pale, but he recovered his equilibrium more quickly. "What was it?" gasped Everts. "Oh, what was it? Am I going mad?" "Going mad? No." "There's a reason why I ask. It concerns someone very dear to me. I have not said much about Agnes Leeds to you. In fact, I have not said much to her, but sometimes I think that I have thought that when my practice was a little better. Good God, Van Brunt, I am not mad, am I? That would make marriage impossible for us." "You are no more mad than I am," said Van Brunt. He gazed at his friend scrutinizingly. "What case have you on hand now?" he asked. "The Day girls, the murder case, you know." Van Brunt nodded. "Just so. You've had that horrible murder thing on your mind, and... Say, old fellow, your collar looks somewhat the worse for wear." "Yes, my laundress failed me this week, and I have been so horribly busy that I have not had time to buy some fresh ones before the stores closed." "Just so. And you wished that there was a Chinese laundry here, I'll be bound." "I don't know, but I did," admitted Everts with a dawning expression of relief. Then his face fell again. "But what of the jade bracelet?" he said. He glanced at his wrist and gave a great start. "Good God, it's gone!" he cried. "Of course it is gone," said Van Brunt coolly. "It never was there." "But you saw it." "Thought I saw it. My dear fellow, the whole thing is a clear case of hypnotism. Something for the psychical research. You were all overwrought with your work, nerves in a devil of a state, and you hypnotized yourself, and then you hypnotized me." Everts sat staring at Van Brunt with the look of one who is trying to turn a corner of mentality. Then the door was flung open violently, and Van Brunt's man rushed in, pale and breathless. "Doctor!" he gasped. "What is it?" "Oh, Dr. Van Brunt, there's a Chinaman dead right out in front of the office door, and he's got 2 stabs in his side, and he's got a green bracelet on his wrist." Dr. Van Brunt turned ashy white. "Nonsense," he said. "It's so, Doctor." "Well, I'll come," said Van Brunt in a voice which he kept steady. You run and get the police, Thomas. Maybe he isn't dead. I'll come." "He's stone dead," said the man in a shocked voice as he hurried out. "Oh, my God," said Everts. If I killed him, what about Agnes?" "I can tell quickly enough which of us killed him," said Van Brunt, rising. Both men hurried out of the room. There was already a crowd around the ghastly thing, and police uniforms glittered among them. The fact that the dead Chinaman happened to be in front of his office had no significance for anybody present. There was no question of suspicion for either himself or Everts. Some men held lanterns while Van Brunt examined the dead Chinaman. It was soon done, and the body was carried away in an undertaker's wagon with the crowd in tow. Then Van Brunt and Everts entered the office. Everts looked at his friend, and he was as white as the dead man himself. "Well?" he stammered. Van Brunt laughed and clasped him on the shoulder. "It's all right, old man," he said. "My knife did the deed." "But," stammered Everts, I was on the heart side." "What if you were? Your knife went nowhere near the heart. Mine cut the heart clean. I lunged around to the front of the thing. Don't you remember?" "Are you sure?" "I know it. You can rest easy now." "But you," said Everts in a voice from which, for very shame, he tried to suppress the joy. Van Brunt laughed again. "It was a poisonous thing," he said. "Did you see his face?" He shuddered in spite of himself. "Men kill snakes of a right," he added. "But how do you explain—" "I don't explain. All you have to consider is that you did not do it, and all I have to consider is that I have set my heel on something which would have bruised it." As he spoke, he was preparing a powder which he presently handed to Everts. "Now, go home, old man," he said. "Take a warm bath, and this, and go to bed, and dream of Agnes Leeds." After Everts was gone, Van Brunt stood still for a moment. His face had suddenly turned ghastly, and all the assuming lightness had vanished. He struck the bell and told his man to bring up another bottle of the old port. When it came, he poured out a glass for himself and gave one to the man. "You've got a turn too, Thomas," he said. The man, who was shivering from head to foot, looked at his master. "Did you see its face, sir?" he whispered. "Better put it out of your mind." "He looked like a fiend. I doubt if I can ever stop seeing him," said the man. Then he swallowed the wine and went out. Van Brunt settled himself again in his old Morris chair and lit his pipe. He gave a few whiffs, then stopped and gazed straight ahead of him with horror. The face of the dead Chinaman was vividly before his eyes again. "Thank God he does not know he did it," he whispered, and a good smile came over his great blond face.
The Heath Fire by Algernon Blackwood. The men at luncheon in Rennie's Surrey cottage that September day were discussing, of course, the heat. All agreed it had been exceptional, but nothing unusual was said until O'Hara spoke of the heath fires. They had been rather terrific, several in a single day, devouring trees and bushes, endangering human life, and spreading with remarkable rapidity. The flames, too, had been extraordinarily high and vehement for heath fires, and O'Hara's tone had introduced into the commonplace talk something new, the element of mystery. It was nothing definite, he said, but manner, eyes, hushed voice, and the rest conveyed it, and it was genuine. What he felt reached the others rather than what he said. The atmosphere in the little room, with the honeysuckle trailing sweetly across the open windows, changed. The talk became of a sudden less casual, frank, familiar, and the men glanced at one another across the table, laughing still, yet with an odd touch of constraint marking little awkward, unfilled pauses. Being a group of normal Englishmen, they disliked mystery. It made them feel uncomfortable, for the things O'Hara hinted at had touched that kind of elemental terror that lurks secretly in all human beings, guarded by culture, but never wholly concealed. The unwelcome thing made its presence known, the hint of primitive dread that, for instance, great thunderstorms, tidal waves, or violent conflagrations rouse. And instinctively they fell at once to discussing the obvious causes of the fires. The stockbroker, scenting imagination, edged mentally away, sniffing. But the journalist was full of brisk information, simply given. The sun starts them in Canada, using a dewdrop as a lens, he said. And an engine spark, remember, carries an immense distance without losing its heat. But hardly miles, said another, who had not been really listening. It's my belief, put in the critic keenly, that a lot were done on purpose. Bits of live coal wrapped in cloth were found, you know. He was a little weasel-faced iconoclast, dropping the acid of doubt and disbelief wherever he went, but offering nothing in the place of what he destroyed. His head was turret-shaped, lips tight and thin, nose and chin running to points like gimlets, with which he bored into the unremunerative clays of life. The general unrest, yes, the journalists supported him, and tried to draw the conversation onto labour questions, but their host preferred the fire talk. I must say, he put in gravely, that some of the blazes hereabouts were uncommonly, queer. They started, so oddly. You remember O'Hara only last week, that suspicious one over Kettleberry Way. It seemed he wished to draw the artist out, and that the artist, feeling the general opposition, declined. Why seek an unusual explanation at all? The critic said at length, impatiently. It's all natural enough, if you ask me. Natural? Oh yes, broke in O'Hara, with a sudden vehemence that betrayed feeling none had as yet suspected. Provided you don't limit the word to mean only what we understand. There's nothing anywhere unnatural. A laugh cut short the threatened tirade, and the journalist expressed the general feeling with, "Oh you, Jim, you'd see a devil in a dust storm, or a fairy in the tea leaves of your cup." And why not, pray? Devils and fairies are every bit as true as formulae. Someone tactfully guided them away from a profitless discussion, and they talked glibly of the damage done, the hideousness of the destroyed moors, the gaunt, black, ugly slopes, 50-foot flames, roaring noises, and the splendour of the enormous smoke clouds that had filled the skies. And Rennie, still hoping to coax O'Hara, repeated tales the beaters had brought in that crying, as though living things were caught, had been heard in places, and that some had seen tall shapes of fire passing headlong through the choking smoke. For the note O'Hara had struck refused to be ignored. It went on sounding underneath the commonest remark, and the atmosphere to the end retained that curious tinge that had given to it of the strange, ominous, the mysterious and unexplained. Until at last the artist, having added nothing further to the talk, got up with some abruptness and left the room. He complained briefly that the fever he had suffered from still bothered him, and he would go and lie down a bit. The heat, he said, oppressed him. A silence followed his departure. The broker drew a sigh as though the market had gone up, but Rennie, old, comprehending friend, looked anxious. Excitement, he said. Not oppression is the word he meant. He's always a bit strung up when the Black Sea fever gets him. He brought it with him from Batum, and another brief silence followed. Been with you most of the summer, hasn't he? Inquired the journalist, on the trail of a pa, painting those wild things of his that no one understands. And their host, weighing a moment how much he might in fairness tell, replied, "Among friends it was, yes, and this summer they have been more, wild and wonderful than unusual. An extraordinary rush of colour, splendid schemes, conceptions, I believe you critics call them, of fire, as though, in a way, the unusual heat had possessed him for interpretation." The group expressed its desultory interest by uninspired interjections. That was what he meant just now when he said the fires had been mysterious, required explanation, or something. The way they started, rather, concluded Rennie. Then he hesitated. He laughed a moment, and it was an uneasy, apologetic little laugh. How to continue he hardly knew. Also he wished to protect his friend from the cheap jeering of miscomprehension. He is very imaginative, you know, he went on, quietly, as no one spoke. You remember that glorious mad thing he did of the fallen Lucifer, driving a star across the heavens till the heat of the descent set alight to half the planets, scorched the old moon to the white cinder that she now is, and passed close enough to Earth to send our oceans up in a single jet of steam? Well, this time, he's been at something every bit as wild, only truer, finer. And what is it? Briefly then he's got the idea, it seems, that the unusual heat from the sun this year has penetrated deep enough, in places, especially on those unprotected heaths that retain their heat so cleverly, to reach another kindred expression, to waken a response, in sympathy, you see, from the central fires of the earth. He paused again, a moment awkwardly, conscious how clumsily he expressed it. The parent getting into touch with its lost child, eh? See the idea? Return of the fire prodigal, as it were. His listeners stared in silence. the broker looking his obvious relief that O'Hara was not on change, the critic's eyes glancing sharply down that pointed, boring nose of his. "And the central fires have felt it and risen in response," continued Rainey in a lower voice. "You see the idea? It's big, to say the least. The volcanoes have answered too. There's old Etna, the giant of 'em all, breaking out in 50 new mouths of flame. Heat is latent in everything, only waiting to be called out. That match you're striking, this coffee pot, the warmth in our bodies, and so on. The heat comes first from the sun, and is therefore an actual part of the sun, the origin of all heat and life. And so, O'Hara, you know, who sees the universe as a single homogeneous one, and, well, I give up. Can't explain it, you see. You must get him to do that. But somehow this year, cloudless, the protecting armor of water all gone too, the sun rays managed to sink in and reach their kind buried deep below. Perhaps later we may get him to show us the studies that he's made. The most, amazing things you ever saw." The superiority of unimaginative minds was inevitable, making Rennie regret that he had told so much. It was almost as if he had been untrue to his friend. But at length the group broke up for the afternoon. They left messages for O'Hara. 2 motored, and the journalist took the train. The critic followed his sharp nose to London, where he might ferret out the failures that his mind delighted in. And when they were gone, the host slipped quickly upstairs to find his friend. The heat was unbearable to suffocation, the little bedroom like an oven, but Jim O'Hara was not in it. For, instead of lying down as he had said, a fierce revolt, stirred by the talk of those unvisioned minds below, had awakened, and the deep, sensitive poet's soul in him had leaped suddenly to the acceptance of an impossible thing. He had escaped. Driven forth by the secret call of wonder, he made full speed for the destroyed moors. Fever or no fever, he must see for himself. Did no one understand? Was he the only one? Walking quickly, he passed the Frensham ponds, came through that spot of loneliness and beauty, the Lion's Mouth, noting that even there the pool of water had dried up, and the rushes waved in hot air over a bed of hard caked mud, and so reached within the hour the wide expanse of Thursley Common. On every side the world stretched dark and burnt, a cemetery of cinders. Great thrills rushed through his heart, and with the power of a tide that yet came at flashing speed, the truth rose up in him. Half running now, he plunged forward another mile or 2, and found himself the only living thing amid the great waste of heatherland. The blazing sunlight drenched it. It lay a sheet of weird, dark beauty, spreading like a black, enormous garden as far as the eye could reach. Then, breathless, he paused and looked about him. Within his heart something long smouldering ran into sudden flame. Light blazed upon his inner world. For as the scorch of vehement passion might quicken tracts of human consciousness that lie ordinarily inert and unproductive, so here the surface of the earth had turned alive. He knew, he saw, he understood. Here in the open sun-traps that gathered and retained the heat, the fire of the universe had dropped and lain, increasing week by week. These parched, dry months, the soil free from rejecting and protective moisture, had let it all accumulate, till at length it had sunk downwards, inwards, and the sister fires below, responding to the touch of their ancient parent source, too long unfelt, had answered with a swift, uprising roar. They had come up with answering joy, and here and there had actually reached the surface, and had leaped out with dancing cry, wild to escape from an age-long prison, back to their huge, eternal origin. This sunshine, what was it? These farthing dips of heat men complained about in their tiny cage-like houses. It scorched the grass and fields, yes, but the surface never held it long enough to let it sink to union with its kindred of the darker fires beneath. These cried for it, but union was ever denied and stifled by the weight of cooled and cooling rock, and the ages of separation had almost cooled remembrance fire too, fire, the kiss and strength of fire, the flaming embrace and burning lips of the Father Son himself. He could have cried with fierce delight of it all, and the picture he would paint rose there before him, burnt gloriously into the canvas of the entire heavens. Was not his own heat and life also from the sun? He stared about him in the silence of the afternoon. The world was still. It basked in the windless heat. No living thing stirred, for the common forms of life had fled away. Earth waited. He too waited, and then some touch of intuition, blown to white heat, supplied the link the pedestrian intellect missed, and he knew that what he waited for was on the way, for he would see the message he should paint would come before his outer eye as well, though not as he had first stupidly expected on some grand, enormous scale. Rather would it be the equivalent of that still, small voice that once inspired an entire nation. The wind passed very softly across the unburnt patch of heather where he lay. He heard it rustling in the skeletons of scorched birch trees, and in the gorse and furze bushes that the flames had left so ghostly pale. Farther off it sang in the isolated pines, dying away like surf upon some far-off reef. He smelt the bitter perfume of burnt soil, the pungent, acrid odour of beaten ashes. The purple black of the moors yawned like openings in the side of the earth. In all directions for miles stretched the deep emptiness of the heatherlands, an immense, dark, magic garden, still black with the feet of wonder that had flown across it and left it so beautifully scarred. The shadow of the terrible embrace still trailed and lingered as though midnight had screened a time of passion with this curtain of her softest plumes. And they had called it ugly, and spoken of its marred beauty, its hideousness. He laughed exultantly as he drank it in, for the weird and savage splendour everywhere broke loose and spread, passing from the earth into the receptive substance of his own mind. Even the roots of gorse and heather, like petrified shadow-eating snakes, charged with the mystery of that eternal underworld whence they had risen, lay waiting for the return of the night of sleep whence fire had wakened them. Lost ghosts of a salamander army that the flame had swept above the ground, they lay anguished and frightened in the glare of the unaccustomed sun. And waiting, he stared about him in the deep silence of the afternoon. Hazy with distance, he saw the peak of Crooksbury, dim in its sheet of pines, waving a blue-plumed crest into the sky for signal, and close about him rose the more sombre glory of the lesser knolls and boulders, still cloaked in the swarthy magic of smoke. Amid pools of ashes in the nearer hollows, he saw the blue beauty of the fireweed that rushes instantly into life behind all conflagrations. It was blowing softly in the wind, and here and there, set like emeralds upon some dusky bosom, lay the brilliant spires of young bracken that rose to clap 1,000 tiny hands in the heart of exquisite desolation. In a cloud of green they rustled in the wind above the sea of black, and so within himself O'Hara realized the huge excitement of the flame this fragment of the earth had felt. For fire, mysterious symbol of universal life, spirit that prodigally gives itself without itself diminishing, had passed in power across this ancient heatherland, leaving the soul of it all naked and unashamed. The sun had loved it, the fires below had risen up and answered. They had known that union with their source, which some called death. And the fires were rising still. The poet's heart in him became suddenly and awfully aware. Ye stars of fire, this patch of unburnt heather where he lay had been untouched as yet, but now the flame in his soul had brought the little needed link, and he would see. The thing of wonder that the universe should teach him how to paint was already on the way, called by the sun, tremendous, splendid parent. The central fires were still rising. and he turned, weakness and exultation racing for possession of him. The wind passed softly over his face, and with it came a faint, dry sound. It was distant and yet close beside him. At the stir of it there rose also in himself a strange, vast thing that was bigger than the bulk of the moon and wide as the extension of swept forests, yet small and gentle as a blade of grass that pricks the lawn in spring. And he realized then that within and without had turned one, and that over the entire moorland arrived this thing that was happening too in a white-hot point of his own heart. He was linked with the sun and the farthest star, and in his little finger glowed the heat and fire of the universe itself. In sympathy his own fires were rising too. The sound was born, a faint light noise of crackling in the heather at his feet. He bent his head and searched, and among the obscure and tiny underways of the roots he saw a tip of curling smoke rise slowly upwards. It moved in a thin blue spiral past his face. Then terror took him that was like a terror of the mountains, yet with it at the same time a realization of beauty that made the heart leap within him into dazzling radiance. For the incense of this fairy column of thin smoke drew his soul out with it, upwards towards its source. He rose to his feet, trembling. He watched the line rise slowly to the sky and vanish into blue. The whole expanse of blackened heatherland watched too. Wind sank away. The sunshine dropped to meet it. A sense of deep expectancy, profound and revenant, lay over all the sun-baked moor, and the entire sweep of burnt world about him knew with joy that what was taking place in that wee, isolated patch of Surrey heather was the thing the Hebrew mystic knew when the soul of the universe became manifest in the bush that burned, yet never was consumed. In that faint sound of crackling, as he stood aside to listen and watch, O'Hara knew a form of the eternal voice of ages. There was no flame, but it seemed to him that all his inner being passed in fiery heat outwards towards its source. He saw the little patch of dried-up heather sink to the level of the black surface all about it, a sifted pile of delicate, pale blue ashes. The tiny spiral vanished. He watched it disappear, winding upward out of sight in a little ghostly trail of beauty. So small and soft and simple was this wonder of the world. It was gone, and something in himself had broken, dropped in ashes, and passed also outwards like a tiny mounting flame. But the picture O'Hara had thought himself designed to paint was never done. It was not even begun. The great canvas of the fire-worshipper stood empty on the easel, for the artist had not the strength to lift a brush. Within 2 days the final breath passed slowly from his lips. The strange fever that so perplexed the doctor by its rapid development and its fury took him so easily. His temperature was extraordinary. The heat, as of an eternal fire, fairly devoured him, and the smile upon his face at the last, so Rennie declared, was the most perplexingly wonderful thing he had ever seen. It was like a great white flame, he said.
Man Who Paid by Jim Preston, as told to Will Wetmore. Jim, said Professor William Arnold to me, I am the only man in the world, I believe, who knows the truth about the murder of Bob Clark, and I would be booted out of my office at the university if I told the truth. I don't know what to do, Jim. I am sorely troubled. Whenever I went through Austin, Texas, I always had dinner with Professor Arnold. He was a professor of physics at the university there, and we were college pals for 3 years at Princeton before he went west. It was there I came to love and admire him for his brilliant scientific work. On this particular night we were dining in a Chinese restaurant on Congress Avenue. The newsboy came through the restaurant selling the Austin daily paper, and Arnold bought one of the papers. When he glanced at the front page, his face turned white, and his hands trembled. I asked him what troubled him. "Jim," he said, "Bob was killed 3 days ago, and the police are no nearer the solution now than they were then." He pointed to a large headline on the page. It read, "Police still baffled over mystery murder." I looked at Arnold, and I noticed the darkness under his eyes. They lacked the luster that I had known for years, and the old assurance that I had always admired in him was gone. "Why should this particular crime affect you so?" I asked. "Tell me about it." "I was glad when you called me today," he replied, "for I had to tell someone what I know about this murder, and I knew I could trust you. I have known no sleep since it occurred. I cannot face my classes and lecture on the laws of science. I always have believed that every phenomenon can be explained by hard and fast scientific laws. I have always laughed at the so-called manifestations of the spirit world. And yet this murder cannot be explained by any natural laws. I feel as though the scientific platform upon which I have built my life is about to crumble away beneath my feet. I still refuse to accept the supernatural. God, how I hate the word. Yet I see no other explanation for the murder." Arnold paused to moisten his dry lips and throat. He ran his fingers through his long hair, and his fingers trembled. Then he continued, "Here is what I know about it. Bob Clark, the man who was murdered, was the best student I ever had. He was in my physics course 3 years ago. Since then, we have been intimate friends. He often consulted me about his work, and I was always glad to give him help and advice. 2 weeks ago he came to me, and he was in a terrible condition. It hurt me to see him, a man over 6 feet in height, so shaken with fear. His fine face was drawn, and there was an uncanny stare out of his eyes. I could not understand it, for he had always been a very substantial person, unemotional, and with a strong will. "Dr. Arnold," he said, before we had time to be seated in my study, "I have been visited by the dead. My God, I am frightened. It is driving me mad, and I am very afraid my wife will see this fear in me. She is in no condition to be troubled, for you know her baby was born yesterday. I gave Bob a drink and managed to calm him, and he told me of the vision he had seen. 3 summers ago, he worked with a bridge construction gang about 40 miles from Houston, in the little town of East Bernard. It is composed almost altogether of ignorant foreign people, who live in a very squalid condition. Most of the women are ugly and fat. Sometimes even the young girls are homely and unattractive. They work in the fields along with the men. They go barefooted and wear few clothes in the cotton fields. Quite often, according to Bob's story, you will find girls at the age of 20, picking cotton, dressed in calico dresses, and nothing more. It is not uncommon to see their bodies exposed by a chance wind. Some of the girls have a youthful charm in spite of their coarseness. Their bodies have soft, curved lines even though they do hard work, because they eat a great deal of fatty food. Bob met one of these girls returning from work one evening. She was pretty. Her comely face and lithe young figure beneath the loose-fitting cotton dress fascinated him. Ordinarily, he would not have been attracted by such a girl, but he missed the companionship of the girls of his set, and of his women companions at school. By some pretext he contrived to walk home with her, and thereafter he met this girl every evening. No one knew of their meetings. He continued to meet the girl secretly until fall, when he returned to the university. Bob told me that the girl loved him fiercely, and that he had a sort of love for her, even though he was engaged to the woman who is now his widow. He never told the foreign girls his true name, and he soon forgot her after he returned to school. He was married the next spring. But on the night before his marriage he was visited by this girl, Bob declared. He was awakened just before dawn by the cry of a baby in his room. The room was dark except for a diffused, glowing blue light, and in the midst of this blue light was a girl of his past, holding a newborn baby in her arms. The vision was indistinct, and before Bob was able to see more, the vision disappeared into the blue light, and the light itself slowly faded away. Bob was frightened and turned on his light. The floor was wet, as if wet clothing had been dripping upon it, and there were smears of yellow clay upon it. In the afternoon paper, Bob read the account of the suicide of the young girl. 3 months before, her family had learned her secret and had driven her away from home. A clergyman's family in East Bernard had taken her in. The child was born 3 days before her suicide. She was found in a large clay water pool behind the clergyman's house. Her child was clasped to her bosom, drowned, as was the mother. Bob was frantic, but he had to go through with his wedding. The vision did not appear again, and Bob soon forgot it in the joy of his wife. The vision never returned until 2 weeks ago, which was the night after the day his child was born. Bob said it appeared in exactly the same manner as upon the first occasion, except that it stayed longer and was more distinct. The baby seemed months older at this second appearance. The girl stood there, in one arm her baby, and in her hand a murderous Bohemian knife, similar to those used by the Bohemian farmers to kill pigs. She slowly advanced toward Bob with the knife gripped hard in her hand. When she was a few feet from him, Bob screamed. The baby in the girl's arm moved, and a low wail escaped from its lips. The girl stopped and slowly disappeared into the blue light surrounding her, and it slowly faded away also. This time the floor was dry and unmarked by clay. When Bob finished the story, he was trembling again from head to foot. Beads of sweat stood out on his forehead, and he reached for the whiskey. I was in a great quandary as to what to do. Of course, I thought Bob was sick and suffering from strain due to the birth of his wife's child. I told him so. I refused to believe in the thing at all, and told him to forget it. He became furiously angry and left me. 3 days later I talked to Bob's nurse over the phone and learned that Bob had locked himself in his room and was refusing to see everyone. I went to his home, but he would not see me. 3 days ago I was summoned to Bob's house just after dawn by the nurse. She said that Bob had been murdered and that his wife wanted me. I went immediately. When I was admitted to the room, the body had not yet been moved. It lay across the bed in a crimson pool. Stuck in Bob's chest up to the hilt was a knife. I am sure it was the one Bob had described to me. The nurse slept in the room adjoining Bob's, and the only door in Bob's room opened into the nurse's room. She was awakened by a terrible scream in Bob's room. She tried the door, but it was locked. Neighbors were summoned, and the door was battered open. It was locked and bolted from within. There were only 2 windows in the room, and both of them had iron bars across them, as you will find in some old Texas homes. The nurse declared that immediately following the scream, she heard a wail of a baby, and the voice of a woman in the room.
The Last of Mrs. de Bourgh by H. Sivia. Letty, Mr. de Bourgh remarked between long puffs on his meerschaum, you've been a fine maid. You've served Mrs. de Bourgh and me for most of 15 years. Now, I haven't much more time in this life, and I want you to know that after Mrs. de Bourgh and I are gone, you will be well taken care of. Letty stopped her dusting of the chairs in Mr. de Bourgh's oak-paneled study. She sighed and turned towards the man, who sat on a heavy sofa, puffing on his pipe and gazing across the room into nothingness. You mustn't talk that way, Mr. de Bourgh, she said. You know you're a long time from the dark ways yet. She paused, and then she went on dusting and talking again. And me? I've only done what any ordinary human would do to such a kind employer as you, sir, especially after all you've done for me. He didn't say anything, and she went on with her work. Of course, she liked to work for him. She had adored the kindly old man since first she had met him in an agency 15 years before. A person couldn't ask for a better master. But there was the mistress, Miss de Bourgh. It was she who gave Letty cause for worry. What with her nagging tongue and her sharp rebukes, it was a wonder Letty had not quit long before. She would have quit, too, but there had been the terrible sickness she had undergone, and conquered with the aid of the ablest physicians Mr. de Bourgh could engage. She couldn't quit after that, no matter what misery Mrs. de Bourgh heaped on her. And so she went about her work at all hours, never tiring, always striving to please. She left the study, closing the great door silently behind her, for old Mr. de Bourgh had sunk deeper into the sofa, into the realms of peaceful sleep, and she did not wish to disturb him. Letty, came the shrill cry of Mrs. de Bourgh from down the hall, get these pictures and take them to the attic at once, and tell Mr. de Bourgh to come here. Letty went for the pictures. Mr. de Bourgh is asleep, she said, explaining why she was not obeying the last command. Well, I'll soon fix that. Lazy old man, sleeps all day with that smelly pipe between his teeth. If he had an ounce of pep about him, he'd get out and work the flowers. Sleeps too much anyway, not good for him. She stamped out of the room and down the hall, and Letty heard her open the door of the study and scream at her husband. Hector de Bourgh, wake up! There was a silence, during which Letty wondered what was going on. Then she heard the noisy clop-clop of Mrs. de Bourgh's slippers on the hardwood floor of the study, and she knew the woman was going to shake the daylights out of Mr. de Bourgh and frighten him into wakefulness. She could even imagine she heard Mrs. de Bourgh grasp the lapels of her husband's coat and shake him back and forth against the chair. Then she heard the scream. It came quite abruptly from Mrs. de Bourgh in the study, and it frightened Letty out of her wits momentarily. After that there was the thud of a falling body and the clatter of an upset piece of furniture. Letty hurried out of the room, into the hall, and through the open door of the study. She saw Mrs. de Bourgh slumped on the floor in a faint, and beside her an upset ashtray. But her eyes did not linger on the woman nor the tray. Instead, they focused on the still form of Mr. de Bourgh in the sofa. He was slumped down, his head twisted to one side, and his mouth hanging open from the shaking Mrs. de Bourgh had given him. The meerschaum had slipped from between his teeth, and the cold ashes were scattered on his trousers. Even then, before the sea of tears began to flow from her eyes, Letty knew the old man was dead. She knew what he had meant by the speech he had said to her only a few minutes before. His heart, was the comment of the doctor, who arrived a short time later and pronounced the old man dead. He had to go, today, tomorrow, soon. After that he put Mrs. de Bourgh to bed and turned to Letty. Mrs. de Bourgh is merely suffering from a slight shock. There is nothing more I can do. When she wakens, see that she stays in bed, for the rest of the day. He left then, and Letty felt a strange coldness about the place, something that had not been there while Mr. de Bourgh was alive. She went downstairs and made several telephone calls which she knew would be necessary. Later, when Mrs. de Bourgh was feeling better, other arrangements could be made. She straightened the furniture in the study, pushing the familiar sofa back in place from where Mr. de Bourgh invariably moved it. Then she knocked the ashes from the meerschaum, wiped it off, and placed it carefully in the little glass cabinet on the wall where he had always kept it. Times would be different now, she knew. She remembered what he had said. "You will be well taken care of." But there had been something else. "After Mrs. de Bourgh and I are gone." Letty could no longer hold back the tears. She fell into a chair and they poured forth. But time always passes, and with it goes a healing balm for most all sorrows. First there was a funeral, then came other arrangements, and there was the will, which Mrs. de Bourgh never mentioned. His things would have fallen into decay but for the hands of Letty. Always her dust cloth made his study immaculate. Always the sofa was in place and the pipe, clean and shining, in the cabinet. There was a different hardness about Mrs. de Bourgh. No longer was she content with driving Letty like a slave day in and day out. She became even more unbearable. There were little things, like taking away her privilege of having Saturday afternoons off, and the occasional forgetting of Letty's weekly pay. Once Letty thought of leaving during the night, of packing her few clothes and going forever from the house, but that was foolish. There was no place to go, and she was getting too old for maid service. Besides, hadn't Mr. de Bourgh said she would be taken care of after Mrs. de Bourgh and I are gone? Perhaps she would not live much longer. And then one morning Mrs. de Bourgh called Letty in to talk with her. It was the hour Letty had been awaiting and dreading. There was a harsh, gloating tone in Mrs. de Bourgh's voice as she spoke. She was the master now. There was no Hector to think of. "Letty," she said, "for some time now I have been considering closing the house. I'm lonely here. I intend to go to the city and live with my sister. So you see, I shan't be needing you any longer. I'll be leaving within the next 2 days. I'm sorry." Letty was speechless. She had expected something terrible, but not this. This wasn't so. Mrs. de Bourgh was lying. It was the will she was afraid of. Letty remembered Mr. de Bourgh's promise. She did not complain, however. Her only words were, "I'll leave tomorrow." That night she packed her things. She had no definite plans, but she hoped something would turn up. Sleep would not come easy, so Letty lay in bed and thought of old Mr. de Bourgh. She imagined he was before her in the room, reclining on the sofa, puffing long on the meerschaum. She even saw in fancy the curling wisps of grey smoke drifting upward. It was sleep. Then, with a start, she was suddenly wide awake. Surely she had heard a scream, but no. And then, as soft and as silent as the night wind, came the whisper, "Letty." It drifted slowly off into silence, and a cool breeze crossed her brow. She suddenly felt wet with perspiration. She listened closely, but the whisper was not repeated. Then, noiselessly, she got out of bed, stepped into slippers, and drew a robe about her. Just as silently, she left the room and walked down the hall to Mrs. de Bourgh's room. She rapped softly on the door, fearing the wrath of the woman within at being awakened in the middle of the night. There was no answer, no sound from inside the room. Letty hesitated, wondering what to do. And once more she felt that cool, death-like breeze and heard the faintest of whispers, fainter even than the sighing of the night wind. "Letty." She opened the door and switched on the light. Mrs. de Bourgh lay in the bed as in sleep, but Letty knew, as she had known about Mr. de Bourgh, that it was more than sleep. She quickly called the doctor, and some time much later he arrived, his eyes heavy from lack of sleep. "Dead," he remarked, after looking at the body. Probably had a shock, fright, nightmare, or something her heart couldn't stand. I always thought she would have died first." Letty walked slowly from the room, down the stairs, still in her robe and slippers. The doctor followed and passed her, going through the door into the outside. She walked, as though directed by some unseen force, into Mr. de Bourgh's study. She switched on a lamp beside the sofa on which she had always sat, and she noticed that it was moved slightly out of place. There was something else about the room, some memory of old days. First, she saw some sort of legal document on the table and wondered at its being there. The title said, "Last Will and Testament of Hector A. de Bourgh." It was brief. She read through it and found that Mr. de Bourgh had spoken truthfully in his promise to her. Beside the will on the table was another object, and she knew then what this something else in the room was. The meerschaum! It lay there beside the document, and a thin spiral of grayish smoke rose upward from it towards the ceiling. No longer did Letty wonder about anything.